Girls, today I'm back here with Topic 8, Section 6, Mass Culture in the 1950s. So we're going to run through 5 objectives today. Examine the rise of suburbs and the growth of interstate highway system. 2. Explain the causes and effects of prosperity in the 1950s on consumers. 3. Discuss post-war changes in family life. 4. Describe changes in education in the post-war period. And lastly, describe the new rise forms of mass culture. So we're going to start here with the suburbs. Why I had you do last week the how the suburbs changed America activity questions. So growth and effects of suburban growth, or causes and effects of suburban growth. 1. You have the lack of urban housing. As population grows, cities are unable to house this growing population. So a man named William Levitt began building mass production of suburban homes. The first Levittown was actually built up in Massachusetts, and then 2 more down near Philadelphia. And you can see what his suburbs looked like, pictured there. Federal and state government assisted by constructing thousands of miles of highways linking suburbs to cities, so people could live in the suburbs but work in the cities. And the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, also provided low-interest homes for people to purchase these new houses in the suburbs. All right. Part B, the interstate supports migration and prosperity. It's under President Dwight D. Eisenhower that the Interstate Highway Act is passed by Congress in 1956. It carries the nation's growing automobile traffic, boosts economic prosperity, and provides valuable transportation. Again, I just talked about the importance of highways to get from your house in the suburb to work in the cities. But it's also going to be extremely important in transporting goods over the coming decades. It was also at the time the largest government expenditure on public works in history. You can see the picture right there of all the, or what the U.S. interstate highway system created. Obviously, you can see in the Northeast, the highly densely populated part of the country, many more interstates constructed than out west. Lastly, it's also going to boost travel and vacation industries. You can see pictured there Disney World, or Disneyland, sorry. Disneyland, Disney World, but other vacation industries will also greatly benefit from the interstate highway system. Another industry that benefits is the automobile. We talked about Henry Ford, assembly line, mass production of cars. Well, after World War II, and especially in the 50s, you're going to have the mass growth of cars. People are going to, almost every family is going to own 1, if not 2 cars. By 1960, 80% of American families owned an automobile. They became increasingly dependent upon their cars to commute to work. Our nation, unlike a lot of nations in Western Europe, are highly dependent on our cars. Why we have more cars than pretty much any European nation, which depends much more on mass transportation. We still do, depending on where you live. New York City, for example, would be a city where mass transportation, subway system is very important. You can see some of the 1950s cars pictured below. But because of the interstate highway system, the car culture, you're going to have new industries that are going to spring up to service the automobiles and the highways. Gas stations like Texaco, fast food like McDonald's begins in the 1950s. All right, part 2, we'll look at increased consumption and consumerism. So A, free enterprise system improves standard of living. During and post-World War II, median family income is going to rise almost $2,000 from around $3,300 to about $5,400. Companies also found innovative ways to encourage buying on credit. So consumers are going to be able to buy more goods than ever before because their purchasing power went up with their income, but also because the ease and access to credit is going to allow them as well. Part B, technological innovations drive new conveniences. You have new home appliances, things like electric washing machines, dryers, refrigerators. You can see ad for the Whirlpool Surge-O-Matic which is a washing machine. You're going to have shopping malls or shopping centers pop up, especially in suburban areas. You're also going to have the growth of the television. By 1946, manufacturers produced fewer than 6,000 TVs in that short 14-year period. By 1960, 90% of all homes owned a TV. So while World War II was towards the end, not many Americans owned televisions. They got their news all from the radio. By 1960, that will change. 1960 will also, first we'll talk about later, the first televised presidential debates as well. You can see some more pictures from the 1950s. What a 1950s kitchen may have looked like. Ads that you would have seen. Obviously, today these ads would seem or appear somewhat sexist, as it's mostly about providing women who are expected, again, mostly to stay at home, take care of the house with some type of new appliance. You can see several versions of 1950s televisions. All right, part 3, families and communities in the 50s. Part 8, the ideal American family. So, during the 1950s, the traditional image of the family took hold. Social scientists coined the term the nuclear family. Again, this is during the baby boom, returning soldiers, their wives, they had children. It claimed that the women needed to accept the role as homemakers. We just saw the ad about the man buying his wife a toaster. So while that was the idea, the mother stayed home, took care of the children, the household, women were challenging this notion throughout the 50s. And by 1960, women held 1/3 of the nation's jobs. We talked about this during World War II, where they filled in any of the factory jobs and service jobs. And when the World War ended, the men returned home. Unfortunately, they had to give up some of those jobs, especially in heavy industry, but they still hold on to quite a lot of jobs. 1/3 of the nation's workforce is women. I mentioned the baby boom. We talked about the last section, but it's going to increase focus on the children. One of the most important child psychologists was a man named Dr. Benjamin Spock. He published a book, Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, that became the best-selling book of the 1950s. There's Dr. Spock pictured there. Emphasized nurturing children. And as I said, baby boomers, because they're the largest block, are going to go on to shape American culture, which we'll see a lot to next section as they become teenagers. Things like rock and roll going to be greatly influenced because of the baby boomer generation. We also saw Billy Graham contributes to religious revival. The evangelist Billy Graham attracted millions to religious revivals that he held around the nation. Organized religion nearly doubled from 50 to 80 million during the 1950s, which is a pretty significant increase, 60%. To reflect that, God added "In God We Trust" to the dollar bill, as you can see pictured there, and "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. A lot of people think "Under God" was always in the Pledge of Allegiance. It was not. It was not added until the 1950s. When you have this massive religious revival, especially in the South and Midwest, and evangelicals, Baptists, Protestants, etc. Part D, specific needs lead to medical innovations. Obviously, we are in the midst of a pandemic now with COVID-19. We talked about death of FDR. He died because there was no cure or vaccine against polio. Well, in 1952, Dr. Jonas Salk discovered a vaccine against polio in the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which conveniently, actually, almost 7 years later now, might have discovered, if you haven't seen the news the other week, a vaccine to the COVID-19. Other new antibodies, such as penicillin, also came into widespread use. Penicillin can be used to treat a variety of ailments. Overall, these medical innovations led to a longer lifespan. You can see Dr. Jonas Salk pictured there on the Time magazine. All right, part 4, educational opportunities and priorities. All right, so defense spending shapes education priorities. 1950s, between 15 and 40% increase in Americans attending college. And obviously today that's even higher. But you start seeing this shift, more Americans attending college post-World War II. States began guaranteeing public education through 12th grade. That was not always a thing, especially in a lot of southern Midwestern states where much of the workforce was agriculture. You mainly went to school into maybe 7th, 8th grade. Well, as long as you learned to do basic arithmetic, read, write, you were considered educated enough, and you could go work on the farm. You really didn't need to learn a lot of math, science, history to work on the farm. But as we shifted from an agricultural to industry, and now, as we saw in the previous section, a service economy, working in the service sector required much more education. States began guaranteeing education through 12th grade. And the reason why is a lot of the funding came from the local and state governments. But Congress did pass, as we talked about, as a response to the Soviets launching Sputnik, the $1 billion National Defense Education Act to promote science and math and engineering in schools. Part B, education becomes more accessible. Many states will adopt what's later called the California Master Plan. Obviously, it began in California, which is 3 tiers. You have community colleges, the lowest tier, which is the most affordable, most easy to access. 3 state colleges will be 4 years, tend to be a little bit cheaper, a little bit easier access as well, like community colleges. And then the highest tier would be research universities. These would be more expensive, require higher grades, so the standards to get in would be much more difficult, so it wouldn't have that ease of access. This would train and create the next future scientists, doctors, engineers, etc. So many states followed California's master plan with their own similar system. Another big event in the 50s that's going to make education more accessible, which we'll talk more specifically about in the Civil Rights Unit next, was the Supreme Court case in Brown versus Board of Education. Many schools in the South, Midwest, etc. around the country, even in parts of the Northeast, were segregated. So blacks went to one school, whites went to another. Generally, African Americans did not get an equal education. Well, this is going to be struck down by the Supreme Court in '54 as segregated schools are ruled unconstitutional. You can see the mother and child that challenged this in the Supreme Court with the help of the NAACP. All right, the last part today is how television is going to shape American culture. So TV news was still generally limited to 15-minute programs. Most Americans still got the news through the papers or radio. Some big introductions to American television culture, though, were comedies that were brought to households with shows like I Love Lucy, Father Knows Best, Leave It to Beaver. They used humor and to reaffirm the white middle-class suburban lifestyle, the idea of the nuclear family, as we talked about. So they really promoted where we should familiarize yourself with conformity, because we'll talk about that next section, the anti-conformity groups. But conformity, this idea of this nuclear family, middle-class suburban lifestyle. You have late night shows like Ed Sullivan, who will introduce rock star Elvis Presley and later the Beatles to American audiences. We'll talk about Elvis next section a little bit more. And then you also had families were introduced to TV dinners, obviously buy those today, and gathered around to watch their primetime shows like Gunsmoke, Maverick, Dragnet, Perry Mason. Again, all this is well before my time. When you get back to school, you can always ask Mr. Bush that he could tell you all about the 1950s television shows. All right, so that's a wrap today, guys and girls.